We have now finally arrived here in the 12th chapter of Deuteronomy, of course, having spent so much time in chapter 11 on and off with Holy Week and the festivities there through Palm Sunday and Good Friday and Easter. We've then had a week of an isolated sermon. We had a visitor last week as well, but we're now finally here into chapter 12. For our visitors, welcome. We are going through an expository series, as I'm sure you can well tell, on the book of Deuteronomy. We actually began this series 2 years ago, almost to the week. We began this the first week after Pentecost, which is, of course, coming up in a fortnight's time, roughly, I think 3 weeks' time maybe. So we're up to 2 years through this book, and we are up to chapter 12, the beginning thereof now. For those who have been with us, of course, you've heard me say that this is a transition here in the book of Deuteronomy, which is, at least in the most part, divided or subdivided into three kind of major speeches on the part of the great prophet Moses. It begins with this introductory portion through the first roughly 4 chapters, detailing and recounting the history of the Israelites, going back to the Exodus and the decades that had followed from this time with their escape and their miraculous rescue from the land of Egypt. From the end of chapter 4 all the way through to the end of chapter 11, we have the first major speech, and now we're into this second major speech, which in terms of its chapters and its content goes from chapter 12 all the way through to chapter 26, about verse 19, roughly speaking, but essentially chapters 12 to 26. It is the heart, as it were, the beating heart of the book of Deuteronomy, and so much so that it is in fact known in theological terms as the Deuteronomic Code. It provides, at least relatively speaking, the greatest depth of command and instruction concerning all manner of areas, particularly related to civic life. The first speech that we've been, of course, working our way through much of has been dealing with other aspects, especially around individual or familial life. We had famously the 10 Commandments retold in chapter 5 of the book of Deuteronomy, laying the foundation for what would then come later on in this book. And now, for us and our understanding, this second speech, the Deuteronomic Code, chapters 12 to 26, deals with larger, more national elements, as it were. Not exclusively, but overwhelmingly so. We see, of course, a number of commands that come up even into the manner of laws and governance. Chapter 18 particularly deals with laws concerning the kings and how the monarchy is to function, etc., etc. But this is the beginning of this particular portion, which will work its way all the way through to, as I said, chapter 26, before we get onto those two infamous chapters of 27 and 28, which we've referenced before, the blessings and the curses that come from abandoning God and violating this covenant. We have in this beginning verses 1 to 4 for us today, familiar language, especially in the way that it begins. Of course, Moses would begin many of his speeches in the same way, with this hearkening, this command to obey the statutes and the decrees of the Lord, which he is giving you this day. But this opening portion does provide for us a very illuminating text, albeit a short one, that guides us in much of the vision of what this Deuteronomic Code will be addressing and dealing with. This language which we see of destruction and the command to destroy idols and tear them down and other such things for the land which, of course, for this new generation of Israelites, they're about to cross over the Jordan River, heading westward into the land of Canaan, a land replete with such paganism and demonic worship. We've seen language that is similar to this before, and we will, of course, see language that is similar to this again throughout the rest of our journey through Deuteronomy. By virtue of that, there is something specific that we're actually going to be wanting to focus on, as it were, in this particular text that really deals with some of these foundational elements theologically and otherwise concerning the command here on the part of the Lord. Because if we do not establish those things, what can occur, which is often what does with passages such as these, is misunderstanding, or especially so misapplication, kind of going hand in hand, as it were, as two sides of the same coin. But these words, blunt and stark as they may appear to us, do have great relevance to us, and indeed to all Christians throughout the ages. It's not necessarily something that's exclusive to us. It is something which rings true throughout the history of the church and of God's people, that we need to ourselves also come to terms with and learn and understand and acknowledge and indeed obey. So, this will be the plan today, going through the first 4 verses. The next portion that we'll come to, verse 5, will almost be looking at exclusively so next week, and then we follow into the Feasts of Ascension and Pentecost, and then we'll come back to Deuteronomy. Okay, so for that's the plan over the weeks going forward. All right, here today, verses 1 to 4. So let's begin in verse 1 of this 12th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. These are the statutes and the judgments which you shall be careful to do in the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess all the days you live on the earth. This opening introductory remark again reminds the Israelites, as we've seen so many times, as I mentioned in the introduction, of the source of this word, the source of these commands, the source of, as the language here suggests, the statutes and the judgments. All these terms are used synonymously, as we have so seen. That the source of this is not just merely Moses. Moses is not, as their leader, simply giving him his opinion. He is indeed the mouthpiece of God. He is the oracle of the Most High. He is the one who proclaims eternal truth. And here he is giving the decrees, the statutes and judgments, to use the words that we have for us in English here, from the Lord, the God of your fathers. Now, of course, for those of you who are with us regularly, you know how often we have talked and seen throughout our journey thus far in Deuteronomy the relevancy and indeed the vital and essential reality of the past that informs much of what Moses commands the people to do throughout this book of Deuteronomy. The hearkening back to the fathers, to our father Abraham, to the patriarchs, to those who came before, we of course have had interwoven throughout many of our sermons, and that has been something that's been so crucial for us to understand, that the past informs the present and helps guide and shape our march into the future. That in this particular case here, he is reminding the people that indeed these are the commands, of the Lord, the God of your fathers. The one who, even as we saw very recently in the ending of Deuteronomy 11, is the God of Abraham, who once walked where these Israelites now, centuries later, hundreds and hundreds of years later, would now embark upon their own journey. This is the source, God himself, who is the very, not only arbiter of divine law, but indeed its very fountain. It's something which we've touched on many times, including in our Bible study as well. The Lord is the very source of all things. He is the source of life. He is the source of love. He is the source of power. He is the source of creation. Everything that is exists in, through, and by him. And nothing that is in being ever came into being apart from his being. He indeed is the very source and fountain of truth, and therefore of law, and therefore of right, and of morality, and of ethics. What is good in the grand cosmic sense is defined not by the arbitrary whim of man's fleeting mind, let alone our emotions. Indeed, what is good and right in the world, what is righteous in that literal sense, what is just, is defined by an ever immutable standard, and that is the very being of the Almighty himself. To understand that God is the source of good and of righteousness is to understand that all that is subordinate to his being, which of course is everything, both animate and inanimate, is therefore subject to that divine order. It is subject, by extension, to the divine law, which indeed not only created but governs and maintains and sustains that divine order. It is the rightful understanding of the hierarchy of being that exists in the cosmos. And to understand this is to understand one's own place individually. It is to understand our place collectively. It is to understand, by extension of that, our obligations, our responsibilities, our, in the most essential term, duty. And that is, among so many other things at its core, the duty to live and to be in conformity, in not just merely allegiance, but in fact in lockstep with that divine order. This is the very essence of what is capital G, good. That very essential component, among the others, of the very fabric of the world in which we live. What is good? Well, it is that which is in conformity to the order that God created. To be outside of that, to be out of alignment with that, to be in rebellion of and against that, to be in a state of rejection in the face of that, is indeed to break down that order. It is, in a word, to embrace chaos. We, of course, so many times have, not only through Deuteronomy, but over the years, repeatedly illuminated unto ourselves the understanding, very fundamental to the world, of how these things relate to each other: light and darkness, good and evil, order and chaos. And of course, many times you have heard me explain that these realities have an inverse oppositional relationship to each other. That is to say that darkness is but the absence of light, that indeed evil is but the absence of good, and that indeed chaos is but the absence of order. This is the byproduct of man's rebellion. To reject and rebel against the divine order of how God created and designed the universe to work, all the way down to the minutiae of your own life, is indeed to act and operate in a state of chaos. It is to eliminate, it is to remove, it is to rail against that order. And in its absence, all that is left is not another form of order, but instead rather a state of chaos, to one degree, of course, or another, inevitably so. And this is why we have the very strong language that then is about to follow for us in verses 2, 3, and 4. It's why it's so important for us to remind ourselves of these fundamental metaphysical truths that the Scriptures so consistently proclaim. Because the depth and profundity that is contained therein helps keep us grounded, as it were, helps keep us anchored to the Almighty. It helps us to walk in the path of light, of goodness, of order, not so defined by we as man, but rather thankfully defined by the very source and essence of being himself. And it is how we are to then understand in that light, pardon the pun, the kind of words and the kind of language that then follows. Because indeed verse 2 begins with what is in no uncertain terms extremely strong language. Now the difficulty is in conveying that in English, especially for one who is more accustomed to reading through the Scriptures and more familiar with this kind of language. The starkness, the bluntness, in fact the vivacity of this particular language can kind of be dulled over time, as it were. But he begins in verse 2 for us, what we have in our scriptures, with a repetition. And this is a common phrase, and again, I'm going to touch on the linguistics for just a brief moment so that we can actually understand the strength of what is being said, not merely for some academic reason. He begins verse 2, this kind of next sentence after having said, "You live on the earth," etc. He begins with a repetition of the exact same word, which means ultimately to destroy or destruction itself. Okay? In a more broad or general sense, to perish. Right? Abaid to abedun. It is a repetition of the same phrase in two different forms. If I were to use very poor English, one might say, "You shall destructively destroy." Okay? Which of course would be redundant for us in English. So I'm saying it's at times difficult to convey the strength of this in the English language. We have different ways of doing it in our mother tongue. But in this particular case, these two words are describing absolute, total, utter annihilation of whatever then happens to follow in that given sentence. It is the plenary destruction, meaning the all-encompassing, the totalizing, the all-inclusive, the absolute and utter obliteration and annihilation of whatever follows in that sentence. Often, if it's relating to people, you will at times get a different phraseology in English. "You shall surely perish." Right? Surely perish. So in that case with the adverb. "You shall surely perish." In this case for us here again, most of your translations in English should say something like, "You shall utterly destroy." Or "you shall destroy to the uttermost," etc. What? Of course, then being the question, what is the subjects and objects of this sentence? Well, in this case, all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods. You shall not utterly destroy some of the places. You shall not utterly destroy the inconvenient places. You shall not utterly destroy only the places which cause problems, but then perhaps leave others. You shall not utterly destroy, depending on which one is politically correct or not. You shall utterly destroy all the places among the nations that you shall dispossess where they serve their gods. And what does this look like? Where? Indeed, of course, as that sentence continues, "on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree." Now, in a general sense here, especially in the modern world, there is a rather substantial disconnect in how we understand those terms, just largely contextually through no fault of our own. Although we, and by us, and by we I do mean we in the literal sense, we here who live in the Blue Mountains, actually quite frankly have a better image and understanding of this than just about almost anyone in Australia, of what high places and sacred groves beneath trees look like. This place, these lands, these Blue Mountains are indeed the home of much of the neo-pagan movement in Australia. Okay? There is a greater and higher percentage of such neo-religious, meaning new religious practices, than anywhere else on the continent. And it is by virtue of the fact that this is one of the high mountains. Okay? We have touched on this briefly before, but to help us understand why this is important. Paganism and ancient paganism in all of its varieties and all throughout history venerates and honours the high places, the mountains. Okay? This is why the Greek gods would reside on Mount Olympus. It is why, of course, the Egyptians would build great mountains, which we know as pyramids, as burial places and in honour of their pharaohs and their gods. It is why, of course, the great ziggurat of Babylon, which we know, of course, by its biblical name, the Tower of Babel, was built in that form, pyramidal structures, ziggurats. They represent and even look like mountains. It is because indeed the mountains have been associated always throughout human culture with the heights and therefore the heavens, and therefore by virtue of the heavens, the powers of the heavens, God and the gods, as it were. It is why, of course, Moses, speaking of the very author of this book, meets God where? Upon Mount Sinai. It is why the capital that is established by David is where, of course? Well, that of Mount Zion, and specifically the city Mount Moriah. It is why mountains, of course, feature over and over and over again. It is because there is an actual sense in which that bears true, in which the mountains do represent the heavens. They are the place that is closer. They are elevated. They are above. They're closer. Even as you stand at the foot of them, they appear to reach out and touch the heavens above. This is the kind of language that's being employed, one which should have been immediately understood, of course, by the initial audience. On the high mountains, on the hills, and under every green tree, sacred groves or trees with statuary and with altars and other such elements is a very common feature of ancient pagan worship, even in its newer revived forms today. These are the places which here the command is given that all such places are to be destroyed. And indeed, he then elaborates in verse 3 particularly a multitude of ways in which this would occur. And you shall tear down their altars, and you shall shatter their sacred pillars, and you shall burn their asherim with fire, and you shall cut into pieces the graven images, i.e. the idols, of their gods, and destroy their name from that place. Now there's 5 aspects that are given, or 5 means, so to speak, 5 ways that are given here. And again, it's not designed to be an exhaustive list. It is Moses using repetition to describe this totality, which of course he begins with in verse 2. You shall utterly destroy. You shall totally and completely annihilate. This is how you do so. You shall tear down their altars. You shall shatter their sacred pillars, what we call obelisks today. You shall burn their asherim with fire. Asherim were a specific votive idol or grove to a very prominent Canaanite female goddess, obviously, named Asherah or Ashtarte, Ashtartu, different names across the languages. Right? A very popular goddess, a mother goddess, a fertility goddess, which was often the consort of Baal, who, of course, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, you will know of the worship among the Canaanites of Baal. Destroy the asherim with fire. You shall cut into pieces, or literally cut down, the graven images of their gods and destroy their name from that place. So we see the physical destruction of idols, be they wood or metallic. We see the tearing down of obelisks or pillars, which themselves, of course, have their origin in Egypt, spread through to the land of Canaan nearby as well. Representative of, again, fertility worship by and large. We see here also the tearing down of the altars, which in this particular case of the land of Canaan, and it's a reminder for some of you, and probably new information for some, such altars included, of course, that of human sacrifice among the Canaanites, who were renowned for their expansive and extensive system of, in their case, especially child sacrifice, where parents would routinely sacrifice their newborn sons especially, but children in general, to Molech, where they would place the child within a bronze effigy of Molech with the man's body and a bull's head, and they would burn that child. And the smoke of that child would come out through the nostrils, and that was the symbol that Molech had indeed accepted that sacrifice for good crops in the coming year, for blessings upon their business, financially, various other aspects. We see also, of course, the cutting into pieces of the images of their God, and also the burning of the Asherim, the destruction of this very prominent example of pagan worship that is then rounded off with destroying their name from the place. And this is actually, interestingly enough, the greatest of these actions, even though it may not seem so. This is a practice which in the ancient world was known, and this is important for you to understand, as damnatio memoriae, which in just simple terms means the damnation of the memory. Why is that so important? And why is it so important to this particular text? The example, the practice of the damnation of the memory was, in no uncertain terms, the worst possible punishment that any person, or I suppose people by extension, could ever face. There are entire examples throughout ancient history of periods in very major portions of the world, like the kingdoms of Egypt and the Greeks and the Romans and others such, where entire years of history are blotted out of the annals by virtue of someone having suffered the punishment of damnatio memoriae, the damnation of the memory. Every single written record of their existence gone. Every single statue of that prominent ruler who committed some particular crime or sin worthy of this, gone. Every single family member, at times even, killed. Certain cultures would go to even the extent of wiping out everyone who ever knew you, so the very memory of you would not even live on. The damnation of the memory, as if you are blotted out from the very pages of existence. God is commanding the Israelites to do this. Destroy their name from that place forever, to the point where in the future your sons will not even know that such people ever existed. Now, this is where we arrive at much of what is the heart of what we need to learn, at least in this particular sermon here for us this morning. This, of course, is not the only place in sacred scripture that uses such strong language, such all-encompassing language, such plenary language to describe destruction, to describe what is ultimately the obliteration and annihilation of paganism. It is, of course, one of the more direct, as it were, one of the more blunt, one of the more obvious. But the reason why I point this out is because of something which does have very direct application to us in our time. An application, again, because we've talked about the theology thus far, we've exegeted elements of the text thus far, we're touching now on the application unto us. This is an application that would not work at other times in the history of the church. Not because I'm inventing something, it's not because it's novel in any capacity whatsoever. It is rather because throughout the absolute preponderance of Christian history, everyone already understood what I'm about to say. To make this remark would be to illuminate unto my congregants that water is wet and that the grass is green, or that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. And it is this, that this particular text, among the others, of course, that are just like it, but this command, what is essentially this command from the Lord, what is this fundamental truth concerning the created order, is not merely or only, in other words, it's not exclusively just some old covenant thing. Okay? It is not just something from that old dusty part of the Bible back there that we look at once every time Halley's Comet comes by and that we pay no attention to because that's that Old Testament stuff. This, the command and the source of the command, keeping in mind that we began this morning by looking obviously at verse 1, which talks about the source of goodness, the source of truth, the source of order. the source from which this command comes has not changed. That is to say, in more elementary terms, that it is not as though the command and the source of this command that was given in these times in the book of Deuteronomy, what is good back then, namely the destruction of paganism, somehow became good in the New Testament by virtue or to the point of us now having to have a different approach to these kinds of verses. What I mean by that, even in a more elementary sense, it is not as though paganism were such a great evil in the days of the Old Covenant that now that has somehow changed. That now such actions we should look back on and go, well, no, that was just in the Old Testament. We now do something different in the New Testament. There is something here now that has changed in what is good and what is evil. Now, for some of you, of course, you'll be thinking very naturally, well, of course that's not the case. Of course, God is consistent in what he commands and what he teaches. Of course, what is good is consistent. That hasn't changed. But the reality is that in much of our time, so much prevails the idea of some great rift or disconnect between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And in fact, not only in our time, but in fact, throughout much of Christian history, to the point where one of the earliest heresies that the church ever encountered was that of what we know as Marcionism. Marcion of Sinope was the heresiarch, in other words, the chief heretic who departed from the faith and fundamentally and essentially taught that the Old and the New Testaments are different in the sense that the Old Testament God is this evil, brutal, barbaric deity, this demiurge who commanded destruction of altars and the shattering of sacred pillars and the tearing down of graven images and the burning of Asherim, etc. However, in the New Testament, we have the kind, loving, compassionate, wandering, itinerant preacher, the, as we might now say in the modern day, the hippie Jesus, who wandered the deserts and who healed people and who sat down and dined with the outcasts of society, etc. And that there is a great contrast between not only what goes on in the Old Testament, but indeed also the way that God behaves in the Old Testament, versus what the New Testament describes and indeed how God acts in the New Testament. Now, in its extreme forms, as I said with Marcionism, held that they were two different gods. However, the path toward that, whilst not obviously reaching that logical conclusion, the garden path that leads one toward that heresy is, of course, to believe that what God considered to be good and evil, and therefore worthy of judgment in the Old Testament, somehow changed by the time you get to the New. Because time and time and time again, beyond counting, have I had to explain or deal with throughout my Christian ministry thus far that we should not be ashamed of such words. That when we look on this kind of language, the first instinct that should come to us is not reflection or repulsion. That nowhere have we been commanded to provide a form of apology on behalf of God for having ever said or commanded such things. To try and act as God's marketing department, his PR team, to kind of shine up and polish his image in our lovely, tolerant, pluralistic, secular society of the modern age. Because the reality is that circa the current year, or 1,000 years ago, or 1,000 years from now, this command was, is, and always will be good. What God commanded here was righteous. What God commanded here was holy. What God commanded here was pure. And it is only by virtue of the failure to understand, the failure to comprehend the great horrors and evil that demonic worship, paganism, reaps upon the earth. It is a failure to understand how the worship of false gods corrupts and corrodes the human soul. And therefrom, and by extension, not in a creative, positive sense, but indeed in the very kind of chaotic one that I described earlier, creates nations, societies, cultures, entire civilizations at certain points that are, in every literal sense, built upon a foundation of demon worship. In fact, the very kinds of people, the Canaanites, even their descent into absolute barbarity, which they were so renowned for, the kind which was being commanded by God to destroy in this very verse, even other pagan cultures looked at them and said, this needs to be ended. For any of you who are history buffs, this is, of course, the very nature of the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage in the centuries that came prior to the time of Christ. The phrase developed, a very popular phrase among the Roman Senate, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Carthage, which over in modern-day Tunisia these days, North Africa, they were descendants of the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians, what is today Lebanon, were one of the Canaanite peoples. Okay, the lands of Tyre and Sidon and Acca, where Jezebel was from, for example. The Carthaginians were descendants of the Phoenicians. They were the very kind of Canaanite peoples, more broadly speaking, that are in view here. And by the time you get to the 3rd and 2nd centuries particularly, BC, their entire civilization is built on piles of bones in the figurative sense. That even the pagan Romans knew and understood that human civilization cannot flourish whilst ever Carthage continues to exist. The great irony, of course, is that for those of you who are familiar with the Old Testament, the Israelites put in much effort to destroy the Canaanite cities. However, through cowardice and compromise and faux compassion, they leave elements of it. They don't follow through. They actually disobey God. And what happens? Well, it comes back to proverbially bite them, as we would say. And that paganism which is left, like a cancer, metastasizes, and it flourishes and it spreads to the point where it takes over Israelite culture. Not totally, but overwhelmingly. We're now in the very temple of God, of course, which would be built many centuries after this. You have right amidst, literally in the very center of the temple, whilst the Lord God is being worshipped, you have Baal being worshipped. You have Asherim. Instead of burning the Asherim, these sacred groves of Asherah, with fire, they instead put it right in the very heart of the temple. Because over time, that is what always happens. The even greater irony of history is that the pagan Romans did a better job of destroying Canaanite worship than the Israelites did, which is a condemnation unto itself. This is the point we must see. This is the point we must understand. We read so many times throughout the New Testament, of course, this language and verbiage of warring against spiritual powers, of warring against darkness, of warring against evil. Okay, and the scriptures, both Old and New Testament, in almost equal measure, mind you, are replete with such militant language because it is a good thing. It is fundamentally good for light to war against darkness, for good to war against evil, for order to war against chaos. And so we see that throughout the New Testament. Again, it's not particularly useful of our time to point to one text, given that there are so many. But throughout the Gospels, throughout the Pauline epistles, throughout the Petrine, throughout the Ioannine, all throughout, we find this kind of language being used. Now, of course, in the context especially of the apostolic epistles from Saints Paul, Peter, and John, we find it especially in application within the church, right? Not only individually, but corporately as well. We find examples such as the book of Colossians, which is dealing more with the individual level. We find examples such as the 2 extant letters to the Corinthians, which are dealing more with the communal, right? The church itself as a body corporate, so to speak. But at either level, that is, of course, the primary focus, the foundation of the church itself. Why is it that I mention that other than the fact that it's true? It is because the distinction that exists there, this is important for you to see, provides unintentionally, it's our own fault ultimately, but unintentionally, an avenue for misunderstanding. And that would be this. Especially in the case of Deuteronomy, where, as I mentioned at the beginning, we are in the Deuteronomic Code, which is dealing with more of these civic, national kind of group levels, right? That when it comes to the New Testament's focus on both the individual and the church as a corporate body, that somehow, again, the shift has occurred in terms of application. Because the argument can be made, and indeed people do try and make the argument, that when God commands the Israelites to, among the nation, again, at this civic level, put an end to evil, put an end to demonic worship, to paganism, that changes in its New Testament application, because now the focus is merely on the individual. By virtue of how often, of course, the New Testament does focus on the individual level, or at least on the church as a corporate body. Here's why that would be a mistake. To pit those two things, in this particular case, the civic or national against the individual, for lack of a better term, is to misunderstand the dynamic of how the Old Testament and New Testaments relate to each other. Because it's not an either or, it's rather a both and. I'll say that again. It is not an either or, it is rather a both and. What the New Testament fundamentally does in regards to illuminating the full and now revealed understanding of the Old Testament is not in doing away, but rather in magnifying, highlighting, and extending the scope thereof. This is why, for example, in the Gospels, we see our Lord say, particularly in the Sermon on the Mount and elsewhere, "You have heard it said, da-da-da-da-da. But now I say unto you, da-da-da-da." Right? So, for example, "You have heard it said, you shall not murder. But I say now to you, whoever has hatred toward his brother in his heart has already murdered him." Okay? Now, for anyone using that, and there's a reason why I use such an obvious example like the command against murder, no one in their right mind would read that and go, well, what our Lord Christ is saying is that the command against murder is now done away with and doesn't matter anymore. Now it's just about how you feel about someone in your heart. Of course not. We would never look at that text and draw that conclusion. And if we did, we should probably be in a straitjacket. In this case, what is he doing? Magnifying. What he's actually doing is he's deepening. He is doing what we perhaps in English would say, comparing the letter of the law to the spirit of the law. In fact, that's where we do get with that phraseology in English, of course, coming from the scriptures. He is giving the deeper spiritual reality that goes to the very heart, pardon the pun, of the matter. He's not doing away with the external written law. Because, of course, as the Lord himself said, think not that I have come to abolish the law, but rather to fulfill it, to uphold it, to maintain it, to complete it. That's what that term fulfill means. Not abolish, but fulfill. What he is saying even in that example is that not only is it true that you shall not murder in the external sense, but you shall not even murder in the heart, which occurs through hatred. He deepens, because this is what the New Testament does. It deepens and expands every time. In the Old Covenant, the sign of the covenant, what we call the initiatory rite, what initiated you into the Christian religion, into the covenant, was circumcision, which is applied, of course, to only one of the sexes. It extended to everyone in the household, but it was only given to one. Yet now in the New Covenant, that sign is given to both men and women, to the male and the female. It is an expansion, not a shrinking. When it comes to these kinds of moral aspects, as well as especially the actions, that are executed in response or as a result of that, right, from that source, in our time we tend to take that very view that I'm speaking against, that was the Old Testament and has somehow been done away with, that now it's actually okay in some sense, even though we might not personally like it, to allow paganism to coexist alongside of us. The problem with that there's many problems with that. The fundamental problem with that is that it is a lie. It is a lie. And it's a lie that we've only believed, I say we in, again, this broader civic sense, given that's the view of Deuteronomy, that we have believed for not all that long. It is a belief that we have had in its kernel form for about 200 years. It is a belief that, in a more obvious external sense, we've really only had essentially since about the time of the end of the Second World War. That tolerating, that coexisting, of course you've perhaps seen those silly bumper stickers on cars, that coexisting alongside of, that tolerating the existence of other religions in and amongst us, in and amongst lands which are historically Christian, in and amongst nations who are descended from Christians, in and among places which in many cases, especially in regards to the Old World, have in no uncertain terms been Christian since the very first century AD, is somehow allowable or acceptable. That such toleration is, in some form or another, by God knows what means, in accordance with the divine will. That something has somehow changed, where our ancestors for the last 2,000 years have known and have actually in many instances gone literally to their deaths as martyrs in seeking to put an end to demonic worship among their own lands and their peoples and those beyond, but yet somehow now for us in our enlightened modern age, we either know better or we know that somehow this is a good thing. History testifies against that idea. If, in some hypothetical sense, a Christian ruler in insert whichever country you might like to choose arose and outlawed false religions, there would be utter droves and hordes of professing Christians who would be decrying that action as somehow contrary to Scripture. The issue, however, is that such an action indeed would betray where their true allegiance lies, and it is not ultimately to God. if your source of good and of evil is different from that which the scriptures describe, if, that is to say, your morality comes from a different source, then indeed it by extension means that the source, obviously, of that law is therefore different. That it's something, and that something is not God. This fundamental aspect is so essential to not just the Deuteronomic Code, not just the book of Deuteronomy, not just the Old Testament, but the entirety of the Scriptures. Because, of course, then in verse 4 of Deuteronomy 12, which we then see finish up our passage here this morning, we see the very opposite treatment given in the alternative direction. You shall not do thus toward the Lord your God. Thus, of course, obviously referring back to the antecedent verses. You shall not tear down, destroy. You shall not burn with fire. You shall not annihilate. You shall not utterly destroy all the places of the Lord God. That is to be built up. That is to be favoured. Because it is right, it is good, it is true. It, in its fruits and byproducts, brings human flourishing. It is in accordance with the divine law. It is in accordance with the natural order. Demonic worship, paganism, and all of its fruits of the brutal elements of slavery, of child sacrifice, of warring, etc., that is to be destroyed. That dynamic has not changed. And again, how this has been applied varies at the different levels. Notice here that nothing in view is for you or I as an individual to go out as an individual and start doing X, Y, Z. There are means and methods by which this is prescribed to occur. However, our problem in the modern age is that we don't have any means or methods by which the defeat of paganism would otherwise occur. All we have done is reduce it down to the minute individual level of individual human conversion. That is how you end paganism, by converting people, which of course is true, at the individual level though. Because as I said, it is not an either or, it is a both and. To hold them as somehow mutually exclusive is actually in contradiction to what the scriptures are saying. It is why we saw, even in our Old Testament reading earlier on in the liturgy from 2 Kings 23, one of the righteous kings of Israel do this very thing. In this case, the southern kingdom of Judah. That of King Josiah, one of the last kings of Judah. The temple was in ruins. It had been destroyed, overwhelmingly at least, by the Babylonians. The book of Deuteronomy, which is referred to as the book of the law, was literally lying in the rubble. No one had read it for generations. Pause on that thought for a second. We're sitting here with Deuteronomy going through it for years. The book of Deuteronomy was literally lying in scrolls in the middle of dust and ruins. No high priests read it. None of the priesthood read it. None of the people, none of the kings. Even though one of the commands for the kings was that they actually had to write their own transcription of the book of Deuteronomy. That gets commanded in chapter 18. Hilkiah, I believe, who was the high priest at the time, don't quote me on that, finds the book of the law, brings it to the king Josiah, and Josiah reads it and is utterly distraught. He's shattered within his heart as to how completely contradictory and contrary the current state of his people were as compared to the commands of the Lord. And so what does he do? Well, he reads in chapter 18 that the king must write his own copy and keep it with him, and he must obey it, and so he does so. And then what does he set out to do? Well, he sets out to do exactly what the book of Deuteronomy describes, particularly in the very beginning here of the Deuteronomic Code. And that's what we had read earlier in chapter 23, particularly verses 1 to 14. He destroys all the idols in the temple. He burns the Asherim. He carries the ashes off to Bethel. He absolutely annihilates the valley of Hinnom to the point where no one can even pass through it anymore. All of the priests, the pagan priests, he slaughters them and puts them to death. Right? Capital punishment. All of the male cultic prostitution and female cultic prostitution houses are destroyed and leveled. He razes them, R-A-Z-E, to the ground. Etc., etc., etc. Complete cataclysmic change. And what do the scriptures do? Do the scriptures condemn him for intolerance? Do the scriptures bemoan his lack of adherence to diversity, equity, and inclusion policies? No. The scriptures praise him as one of the most righteous kings in the history of the Israelites. He is universally, ubiquitously, and unequivocally adored and promoted by God. Now, this speaks to my very point. It speaks to the very heart of what we're actually seeing here today. You could perhaps, potentially, make the argument that only those early generations, as they were first marching into the land, were commanded to wage war and to destroy these pagan practices and to put an end to the demonic worship. But then once they had conquered those lands, they would have settled down and be more tolerant of things. No. This is 800 years after the time of Moses, in which paganism now flourished precisely because people stopped obeying God's law, and our predecessors in the faith, those Christians of the Old Testament, stopped enacting and enforcing this very thing. King Josiah lived in the exact kind of time that we do, where it is in fact God's own people, shamefully and regretfully, who have stopped obeying his word, who have tolerated and allowed demonic worship to flourish in their own nations, who have indeed and in fact promoted it as a civic virtue under the guise of such things as freedom of religion. That an apparent right exists to worship demons and to promote all the actions that then come with that. Explain then how it is that kings like David, kings like Hezekiah, kings like Josiah are praised and approved for taking the very opposite stance to that notion. The answer is that we can't. We desperately need to recapture a grounded, biblically sound understanding of the relationship between the one true religion, Christianity, and every single other one. And it is not one of toleration. It's not one of appeasement. It is not one of upholding utterly novel and unheard of concepts prior to the Enlightenment, such as the freedom of religion. Because the reality is that evil, as you've heard me so many times say, has no right. There is no right to worship demons. There is no right to sacrifice your children in service to those demons. There is no right to engage in all manner of evil, all manner of idolatry, all manner of pride and of lust and of adultery and of abuse that comes as a result of peoples and cultures who worship demons. Only destruction follows such a society that allows it, let alone promotes it. And so our vision across the coming generations really should be, even within ourselves, first and foremost, our families by extension, our children, our grandchildren, our churches. We need to stop tolerating evil as if that was some revolutionary concept. We need to promote what is good and true and righteous and beautiful, and not tolerate what is evil and dark and chaotic and corrupt. Or such passages as these will stand in condemnation of us on the great day of judgment. Amen.